Bowing to pressure to stand aside, Nouri al Maliki quits as Iraq's Prime Minister at a time of national crisis. But can his replacement succeed in uniting the country and defeat armed groups threatening the nation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. He's been accused of misrule and monopolising power, devising politics that have fractured Iraq and opened the door to fighters from the Islamic State and a Sunni rebellion. Nouri al Maliki has agreed to step down after 8 years as Prime Minister. Now, in a sudden change of heart, Maliki caved into domestic and international pressure, backing a rival politician to take his place. Haider al-Abadi is from the same Shia political party and now faces the challenge of reaching out to Sunnis and Kurds, forming a new inclusive coalition and stitching the country back together. Jazeera Erbil helps get our discussion underway.
After weeks of insisting he would not step aside, this announcement.
In order to enable the political process to go forward and form the new government, I'm withdrawing my nomination from the post of Prime Minister in favour of the dear brother Haider al-Abadi for the sake of the best interests of the country.
It's a country at war, with itself as well as against the Islamic State group. Kurds and Sunnis had insisted that Maliki be replaced, but he had also lost support from his own Shia allies. Crucially, even the Shia religious leadership urged him to step down, convinced that he could no longer hold the country or the Shia community together. Maliki had insisted that his political bloc won the largest number of votes and that the move to replace him amounted to a political coup.
I face a ferocious personal attack by some who claim that I was protesting out of my personal interest, but I was only carrying my duties in protecting the Constitution.
Maliki became Prime Minister 8 years ago when the country was in the grip of civil war. He presided over Iraq regaining its sovereignty after U.S. occupation, and in 2011 oversaw the exit of U.S. troops. Although he alienated his political allies, until recently he retained considerable popular support. In one of his boldest moves in 2008, he sent the Iraqi army into Basra to retake the city from Shia militias. Despite that, Maliki's political legacy is seen as a sectarian one. Under his watch, Sunni protests erupted across the country, accusing his government of marginalizing and mistreating them. That anger against Maliki's government and its security forces was fertile ground for the Islamic State group. When IS fighters moved into Iraq's second-largest city of Mosul, they met no resistance as Iraqi army commanders appointed by Maliki disappeared. In 2006, Maliki was a compromise candidate, not seen as a threat to anyone. He ends his term viewed as a threat to almost everyone. With this announcement, Maliki now becomes a caretaker prime minister until a new government is formed. He's still a member of parliament, and among the posts he could be offered are vice president or deputy prime minister. Although he's stepping aside, no one expects him to disappear. Jane Araf, Al Jazeera, Erbil.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In London, we have Ghassan Al-Attiyah, Director of the Iraqi Foundation for Development and Democracy. Joining us from Baghdad is Mark Kimmett, a former US State Department official, retired Brigadier General and former Deputy Director of Operations for Coalition Forces during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And completing the panel from Brussels is Nikolai Mladinov, UN Special Representative for the Secretary General for Iraq and head of the UN Assistance Mission in Iraq. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Mr. Ghassan Al-Attiyah, let me start with your good self. I mean, now that Mr. Maliki has stepped down, he has 30 days to certainly see whether the Prime Minister designate can put a government in place. History has shown in the past that Iraqis never quite seem to get their act together, and there may be more delays, which could mean that Maliki stays in charge.
That's absolutely true. But the fact that the crisis is so intense and the Islamic State, by its adventurous approach and by attacking the Kurds, concentrated the minds not only of the Iraqis, Shia, Sunni, and the Kurd, but also the regional power, and more than that, the European and the United States. This is an opportunity. If we squander it, the repercussion will be dire for all these partners. So I think the pressure will be very intense that this government should be formed. And my guess, what is left now is around 3 weeks only. All the indications that it could be formed within this period, especially when al-Maliki now withdrew his objection. And the other factor in this, the regional countries, for the first time, the Saudis, the Qatari, the Gulf states, as well as Iran and the United States and Turkey and others, shown their support to Baghdad, to the new Prime Minister designate. And they also can help.
Well, I'll get on to that, sir, just a moment. I just want to get a quick brief impression, certainly, of what's going on. Mark Kimmett, what has changed on the ground? How important has it been for Maliki to stand to one side now, having been really in the forefront of Iraqi politics for, 8 years, but now on a decade, you could say?
Well, first of all, I think everybody needs to turn a new chapter after a period of time. No one stays in power forever. No one should stay in power forever. But I think it's also important that on the ground, we recognize that for a period of time, Prime Minister Maliki remains the interim prime minister, and Haider al-Abadi is simply the prime minister designate. During this interregnum, there remains the threat from ISIL, and I certainly hope that people don't discard Prime Minister Maliki during his interim time period, because they've got a fight that they've got to deal with. And if people reject or ignore Prime Minister Maliki, that's going to befall to the advantage of ISIL.
Well, let me just bring in then Nikolai Mladinov in Brussels, just to give us a broad perspective. Now we certainly heard from our previous two guests. Foreign ministers from Europe are meeting where you are. You're there as the Secretary-General's special representative. How important and vital is this time period for Iraq now to try and make sure they can put a prime minister in place and form a government from where you are?
It is a crucial time for Iraq, and this is well understood in Europe as well as elsewhere. Iraq does need to turn a new page. In fact, Iraq will never be the same country as it was before the fall of Mosul. And everybody in Iraq needs to understand that now is the time to make compromises and to find a way of accommodating the legitimate political, social, economic, security demands of the various communities that make up the country. This window will not stay open for long. It opens with the government formation process, and I agree with the previous speakers that Prime Minister designate Haider al-Abadi, a very competent man, should use his time very well in the next couple of weeks to form an inclusive government. An inclusive government really is the key to resolving Iraq's problems. They are largely security related, but they cannot be resolved only on the military battlefield.
Well, let's allow our viewers, firstly, to catch up with what has been going on in Iraq. And so, as we mentioned, the man nominated to take over as Iraq's Prime Minister is also a member of Nouri al Maliki's Shia Dua party, but is seen by allies as a more moderate figure. Now, Haider al-Abadi studied electrical engineering in Baghdad and completed a doctorate in Britain. He became an outspoken critic of Sunni leader Saddam Hussein. The Ba'ath regime executed 2 of his brothers and cancelled his Iraqi passport. Now, Abadi returned to Iraq from exile in 2003 and became an advisor to Nouri al Maliki, going on to challenge him for the post of Prime Minister in 2006 and 2010. And if Abadi does succeed in becoming Prime Minister, here's what he'll have to contend with, namely building a more inclusive government, as we've just mentioned, that represents all Iraqis, and linked to that, rebuilding national institutions such as the army. All this is important to defeating armed groups like the Islamic State, which has seized large swathes of the country in little more than 2 months. It is a desperate situation, Mr. Al-Attiyah, for certainly the Iraqi government that may come into power now. Is forming a government that's sufficiently inclusive to win the trust of Sunnis and undermine the IS going to be difficult?
It is a foregone conclusion. Without forming a government whereby the Sunni provinces feel that they are really represented, they will not really take side with the government to fight the ISIS. So if those who are thinking, if their priorities is to weaken and to defeat ISIS, then they have to do their best to win the heart and minds of the Sunni provinces. Having said this, we have another difficulty. In the Sunni provinces, there are different factions. Some of them are maximalist. They will not accept anything except the change of everything. And then there are different rivalries grouping here and there. So they will have a difficult time. So far until today, I've heard 2 statements from different groups from the provinces declaring what are their aims and what they want. One is in favor of decentralization, federal state, and the other is more in line with the old idea of unitary Iraq. In this sense, the Sunni needs also help from their Arab countries to help them to unite, to help them to formulate a moderate objectives and to start believing in the need for a compromise.
Mark Kimmett, how important is it now, listening to what Mr. Al-Attiyah has to say about the influence of Sunni politicians, both in Baghdad and in the north of the country where ISIL is, saying we can take care of ISIL if you can get your act together in Baghdad?
Well, I think that to a great extent he's correct. The Sunnis are going to come back into the government if they see that they will be included in the decision-making and will truly participate, not just have a presence inside the government. ISIL requires the support of the local population to exist. As we saw in the 2006 Sawa, if the population turns against the terrorists, they lose that sea that Mao Zedong talked about, where a terrorist must be able to swim like a fish in the sea. If they can't either rely on or terrorize the local population, they won't be able to sustain themselves. If the Sunnis believe that they're going to be part of a new Iraq political system where they are included, that is going to be a major setback for ISIL. It will be significant, but it won't be decisive.
Nicola Mladenov in Brussels, you're dealing now with foreign ministers who are gathering to discuss how to deal with Iraq in various forms, humanitarian, military. Normally warring groups would go to the UN to say, look, you mediate on this, but ISIL aren't going to come to you. So what position do the UN take with regard to dealing with Europe and then dealing with the United States, who are heavily involved or will be heavily involved in this situation in Iraq?
Well, I think there's a general consensus on what the problems are. Currently, they are firstly humanitarian, and this is where the United Nations is very much engaged with the authorities in both Baghdad and Erbil in helping alleviate the effect of the fighting on civilians. Secondly, there are political, and this is where the government formation process comes in, but it comes in only as a first step, because an inclusive government is just the first step of what needs to happen. It's really important for for the new government to have a very clear program that delves into the problems that all communities in Iraq face. There are a number of legitimate Sunni demands that need to be met. However, there are a number of Kurdish demands that also need to be addressed, and there are many problems that are outstanding also in the Shia community that need to be handled. Now, it's very important at the very beginning of this process that political leaders do not approach the government formation process from the perspective of putting forward red lines and demands, but rather look for where are the possible compromises. And I think this is where the UN will be very much engaged in. And the last challenge, the security challenge, that cannot be addressed without the full cooperation of Baghdad and Erbil, but the support of people on the ground. And for that, we need to understand that in the areas that are controlled by ISIL, it is not just ISIL. It is ISIL plus former Ba'athi officers, disgruntled tribes. Everyone there has a different agenda. There are people who want to be part of a new government or a new establishment. There are people who are challenging the constitutional order, and then there are the real extremists on the side of ISIL. Okay. The convolution of the three factors is what can really be the solution to the problem in Iraq.
Okay, let's bring in Mark Kimmett here, because one of the big issues about the scenario that it's unfolded over the past few months, Mr. Kimmett, is the position of the Iraqi army, the state it was left in before or as America withdrew. Did the United States leave too early? Did you actually train the Iraqi army to a standard where they could have defended the country? Because to all intents and purposes, they haven't been able to do that, have they?
Well, let's be clear. In 2011, the Iraqi military was in pretty good shape. But if you don't train on an individual or collective basis for a period of 3.5 years, you're going to see those skill sets degrade. That's one of the reasons why America pushed so hard for a status of forces agreement in 2011, which included leaving behind a residual force that would train, mentor, advise, and conduct limited counterterrorism operations. One can only wonder if that force had been agreed to, if we would have, number one, seen the degradation of the Iraqi military's capabilities in that time, and number two, if ISIL would have been able to gain the foothold that it has gained over the past couple of months.
Mr. Al-Attiyah, would you agree with that the Americans left the Iraqi army in good shape?
I would say definitely it was in a better shape, and also there was professional leadership, command that was there. Unfortunately, Al Maliki, once the American out of the scene, he started to bring to consider loyalty to him and those who are attached to him most important. I remember there are a number of generals starting from the mukhabarat, the intelligence department.
When you say loyal to him, sir, just briefly, when you say loyal to him, are you saying more Shia or more pro-Dua party and less Ba'athist or less Sunni? What do you mean by more loyal?
It is ironic. Yes, it is ironic. Not only Shia, he brought some of the Sunni who actually believed and were loyal to him personally. And it was not known, and I know Al-Maliki myself. He used to give commands from a cell phone directly to even to division and regiments. And then, in this sense, those new leaders, some of them are incompetent, some of them failed to be more professional. They tried to please him, to tell him everything is okay. In addition to all this, the army turned to be more dysfunctional and corrupt. Once you have the corruption in the army, where some of the generals get their job by paying bribe sometimes in hundred thousands of dollars, because they can use their position to gain money, and in this sense the army was not in shape to fight. But of course nobody will tell Al-Maliki that the army is in such a shape. Okay. And more than that, he included in the army what we call in Arabic damage, that he add them to army people who are not professional, simply because they are part of the militia in the Badr or in other groupings, and these people are lacking the sophistication and the professional side of it.
Let me bring in Mark Kimmett here, because I think we get your point here, because of the sectarianism and the divisiveness that is the accusations that are being led, Mark Kimmett, towards Al-Maliki were raised back in 2007 when the then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton raised concerns, and I quote, she says, "I share Senator Levin's hope that the Iraqi parliament will replace Prime Minister Maliki with a less divisive and more unifying figure when it returns in a few weeks." Of course, Senator Levin was part of the committee, the chairman of the committee for the Senate Armed Services. I mean, the writing was on the wall. The Americans knew what Maliki was like. And yes, of course, the White House must have spoken to Maliki behind closed doors to, be more inclusive, but that didn't happen. Why?
Maliki is the leader of his own country. He listens primarily to his own internal influences. The U.S. presence significantly diminished during that time period. But I think that any leader of a sovereign nation is going to take into account the voices from other countries. But at the end of the day, he's going to listen to his own domestic voices, his own domestic inputs, and do what he believes is in the best interest of himself and his own domestic interests as well.
But how about the domestic interests of the United States? They were certainly paramount at that time.
As I had mentioned earlier, were we able to have negotiated a status of forces agreement that would have left a residual U.S. force of 10,000 or so, what we're trying to do inside of Afghanistan right now, I think that would have given us a much larger seat at the table and much more influence with the Maliki government. Yet those negotiations broke down. There's a question which side walked away from the table first. But at the end of the day, you did not see an American presence, significant American presence, either military or diplomatic after 2011. And the influence that the Americans lost as a result, I think, speaks for itself.
Nikolai Mladenov in Brussels, influence is a very important strategic scenario at the moment, and levels of influence come from the US, from the UN, from Europe, from Iran. Where do you see this moving forward in terms of how Baghdad actually tackles with ISIL and how you deal with a military conflict as is and a humanitarian crisis which is developing?
Well, let me say firstly that with all due respect, I think it's rather oversimplifying the problem that Iraq faces to just pinpoint all the problems that the country has to Prime Minister Maliki. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a substantial influence from the conflict in Syria on the situation in Iraq. ISIL has grown strong in Syria. It's been able to bring in a lot of foreign fighters across the border into Syria, initially in the Anbar province, in the Nineveh province, and then in the fall of Mosul.
But on the problems in Baghdad, you say that this is too simplified. But if the problems in Baghdad politically had been solved, it had been an inclusive government that allowed everybody in Iraq to have a voice properly, then we wouldn't perhaps have this ISIL problem now. So you've got to put some of that blame on Mr. Maliki.
The problems in Baghdad are not just the inclusive government. The real problem in Baghdad is the unfinished constitutional agenda. That you have the Iraqi constitution, and large parts of it have not been implemented because there hasn't been agreement in parliament on that. Revenue sharing between Baghdad and Erbil, Federation Council, the federal court law, a number of other pieces of legislation that the constitution requires have not been put in place. And I do hope that the next government will attempt to address them very, very quickly and address them constructively in an inclusive manner, obviously. But to look forward, I think it's really important at this point to realize that it is a shared responsibility. The future of Iraq is a shared responsibility between Iraq's leaders, the region, and the international community. ISIL has grown to be a problem that is not just a problem for Iraq, it is a problem for the region and for the international community. That is why the UN Security Council later today actually will be discussing a resolution on this subject. International support is vital. Cooperation within the region is vital. Stopping financing towards terrorist networks, making sure that countries cooperate in addressing the terrorist threat. And last but not least, obviously what is happening in Iraq is vital. Rebuilding national institutions, starting with an army and cleaning up many of the problems that have been plaguing the Iraqi army for a decade now. Corruption, indeed, is one of them. The lack of a national identity, a very, very important political and social problem. An identity that is inclusive, that brings Shia, the Sunni, the Kurds, the minorities together. All of this is extremely important. Not one person can resolve these problems alone, and it really needs to be a team effort from inside the country, because I will admit that at the beginning of the latest crisis, there were some in Iraq who were saying, well, ISIL is a problem for the Sunnis. Then others were saying, well, ISIL is a problem for the Shia because it targets only the Shia. What we've seen over the last few weeks is that actually ISIL is a problem for everybody. It targets the Shia, the Sunni, the Kurds, the minorities have been in a terrible situation. We're talking about crimes that can easily be classified as crimes against humanity, the ethnic cleansing of various minority groups from areas where they've lived for thousands of years. Now, that cooperation needs to be brought to the front again. And I am a little bit encouraged over what happened in the last couple of days, where we did see Prime Minister Maliki in an address yesterday say that he is withdrawing his challenge to the nomination of Haider al-Abadi to be the next Prime Minister. This actually paves the way for a peaceful transition of power in Iraq. And if that peaceful transition of power in Iraq happens, it will be a historic first. The country has seen too much blood and too much violence in its history.
Well, we shall see what does happen. And as you say, no one person can solve the problems of Iraq. I don't think no one programme can discuss all the issues of Iraq. But for the moment, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all. Ghassan Al-Attiyah in London, Mark Kimmett in Baghdad and Nikolai Mladenov in Brussels for joining me on Inside Story today. Thank you very much. And do please add your voice to the discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or go to @AJ Twitter Inside Story. I'm Sahil Rahman. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.